to the good, the bad, the ugly of the food security in South Africa webinar presented by FairPlay in partnership with Food for Mzansi. My name is Dawn Numdu. I am the editor for audience and engagement at Food for Mzansi, and I am honored to be facilitating today's discussion. I have a number of experts joining me to lift the veil on how food security and social stability are interconnected. This is, of course, after widespread looting and anarchy in parts of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal that not only crippled the economy in July, but also disrupted food security in our country. So now South Africa is regarded as food secure at a national level, but not on a household level. 1 in 4 people in South Africa live below the poverty line, food poverty line. And this is a big part of the discussion we will have today. Experts include FairPlay founder Frans Verbed and development studies lecturer Dr. Mark Wegerif, and we will explore the top food security concerns and strategies to address this. Dr. Wegerif is a postdoctoral fellow at the Human Economy Program of the University of Pretoria. We're also joined by Mervyn Abrams, the program coordinator at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. This organization focuses on research and advocacy issues pertaining to economic and social justice. We also have on as a panelist, Hamlet Hlomendlini, a senior agricultural economist who will address food security concerns in the agricultural value chains and agro-processing. Now, without any further ado, I now hand over to FairPlay founder Frans Verbed to share the opening remarks.
Thank you, Dawn. I really look forward to this discussion, and my own welcome to all our panelists as well. It's a very timely discussion because next month is the UN Food Systems Summit in New York. And you have rightly pointed out that from the riots to unemployment, recently released numbers extremely high, 39%. The issue of poverty and unemployment and food poverty is actually one issue. It's all intertwined. And the figures are absolutely horrific. I mean, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimated that last year, in 2020, between 700 and 800 million people faced poverty in the world. And a fifth in Africa. So 200 million people in Africa faced hunger. So we cannot ignore this issue. It's also a good time because, as you know, it's Spring Day next week. It's the start of the planting season. And perhaps this is a good time to try and plant some seeds about solutions as we look forward. Because although, as you pointed out, we are a food secure nation at the national level, we still have 7 million people going hungry. And that's just wrong. We can't abide that. So the question is, what can we do to improve food security? Not necessarily in the next planting season, although it would be wonderful if one of you could come up with something, but in the medium to longer term, because systems take time to change. And we are already in FairPlay fighting against predatory trade, which we believe underlies the whole issue of jobs related to security. One of which, and it's a thing that simply tugs at me all the time, is malnourished children, because child stunting in South Africa is enormously high. And that's the future. If we don't have fully functional adults because of malnourishment now, we don't have a future for the country. So hungry essentially is everyone's problem. We have Christmas coming up very shortly, would you believe that? And so we should look at ways in which we can make this at least Christmas that's not a hungry Christmas for people in South Africa. So with that, I'd like to kick off the discussion by asking Mervyn. Mervyn, how do we deal with this issue of jobs and hunger?
Thank you, Francois, and good afternoon to all the viewers. Really, that issue is totally interconnected, and unless we see hunger and food insecurity at the household level as being intertwined with the economy and economic growth and job creation, we will never really be able to tackle this issue properly. The reason for that is that South Africans are by and large net buyers of food. We access our food from the supermarket shelf and from the informal retailer. And so it's a question of affordability, the relationship between what the food item costs and the amount of money that I have in my pocket. Now, when you look at these two ones very quickly, as means of introduction, let's look at income. So we have an unemployment rate of 43%, an expanded unemployment rate. Now that is extremely high, which means that of the rest of the workers, they would have to feed almost 5 persons on each wage. If we take the national minimum wage as the bargaining stick, then we divide that, we see that that is 3,643 Rand. Divide that in a household of 4 and you arrive at 847 Rand per capita. Now that is at the level of the lower bound poverty line. So that's the one side of the equation. The other side of the equation with regard to prices is that our food basket, our household affordability index for this month, shows that a basket of 44 basic foods for a household of 7 now cost 4,241 Rand. This is an increase of 384 Rand over the past 12 months. So when you look at that and you consider that transport and electricity take up 54% of a national minimum wage, the rest is then left for other expenses, including food, we can begin to see how food insecurity at the household level is intertwined with poverty, joblessness, and a non-growth economy, etc.
Mervyn,
so by means of introduction.
What a dire picture. It's really terrible. Hamlet, it seems economics and economic growth is at least an important part of this solution. How do you see things?
Hamlet, I think your mic is...
Unfortunately, we can't hear you. In the meantime, I'm going to ask Mark. Mark, how do we?
Thank
what
you
do we
very
do?
much, Francois.
Oh, now you can hear us, and we can hear you. That's wonderful.
Sorry about that. So you spoke about economic growth. It's funny because I was looking at the South African economic growth and specifically looking at the agricultural sector, and we know that we have a very, very good agricultural sector in South Africa, which has shown a lot of robustness in terms of growth over the past years. And we have actually expanded production to actually the highest levels. And we are seen in the world as one of revered role players in agriculture. And this actually is attributable to a number of things, Francois, but most of all, I think it's the use of technology that we have adopted in the country, which is helping in the growth of the industry. But the problem with regards to the growth in this country, and even if you go down per sector, you will see that it lacks inclusiveness. And the reason for that is due to the fact that not a lot of people in South Africa are able to actually participate actively in the economy. And certainly when you look at the agricultural sector, for instance, and you delve deeper into that growth that we have been seeing over the years, you will realize that it's mostly coming from one side. We have a dualistic agriculture in this country, but that dualistic nature of the agricultural sector means that only one particular side of the sector or value chain in agriculture is contributing to that growth, which is mainly the commercial large-scale agribusiness enterprises, which are driving growth in the sector. And if you look at the small-scale agribusiness enterprises, which are mostly operated or managed by Black citizens in South Africa, they're not making a meaningful contribution to that growth. And therefore, if you're not able to participate in the growth of the economy, it therefore means that also the gains will be minimal for you. And that is what we're seeing in South Africa currently, is that we have this huge growth that we're seeing, particularly in the agricultural sector, but not the whole economy, just the agricultural sector, but it's not inclusive enough. And that's where we need to actually look into how do we achieve an inclusive growth in the agricultural sector in South Africa. And touching on what you have touched on already, Don has touched on, Melvin has touched on, is that we have this huge unemployment rate in this country. We saw the numbers that came out yesterday. They are painting a very bleak picture, and we need to do something. And I've always said that in this country, we don't necessarily have a food security problem, but we do have what I call an unemployment problem, because the reason why people are not able to get food, the reason, to your point that you made, we have 7 million people going to bed hungry every night. It's because they do not have income, they don't have employment, and therefore that is one thing that we need to look at to ultimately be able to address the household food insecurity at a household level.
Thank you so
Hamlet.
much. Thank you so much, Hamlet. Francois, I'd maybe like to just come in here and maybe just also mention that we do have an interactive question and answer session here on this discussion, on this call as well. So if you do have any questions, we do have something from Gwen Foster. But before we get to Gwen's question, I'd maybe like to get Dr. Wegerif to come into the conversation, and specifically on the last points that Hamlet raised with regards to the unemployment rate that is so high in our country. And one of our biggest challenges is finding ways to support the poorest members of our community to be able to feed themselves. And this obviously is also connected with dignity and respect. How do we tackle this on a grassroots level, Dr. Wegerif?
Well, yeah, thanks very much. And thanks to everyone who's here for having me on the panel. Let me just start out by challenging a bit of the language we use. First of all, this thing that we are, as a nation, nationally we're food secure. I want to reject that notion. It's not the country like the land of South Africa that eats. What can be food secure? It has to be the people. It has to be the people of South Africa food secure, and they obviously are not food secure. So let's even stop talking about as a nation or nationally we're food secure. We're not. Maybe within the boundaries of this country, we do produce, and there is enough food produced to feed everyone. But as a country, which is to me the people, we are not food secure. And then I want to challenge Hamlet. This is not a good agriculture and food sector. It's a disastrous agriculture and food sector. And you gave some of the reasons why it's good. But I don't want to start out from an assumption that this is a good sector. It's not a good sector when it is as unequal as it is. It is not a good sector when so many people go to bed hungry. It's not a good sector when the technology that makes us internationally recognized as highly productive is shedding jobs and leaving people without incomes that they need to buy food. Then it's not a good sector. And when it grows, but it only grows for a few, then it's not a good sector. There's about 7,000 farmers in South Africa, or farms. Sometimes these are just investment companies now owning tracts of land that account for, which is about 0.28% of those who farm in the country, produce about 80% of the output. And then we have about 2.5 million people who do some small Nyana farming, but it's not able to contribute, obviously because of loss of land, because of challenges of access to markets and so on. So it's not working. it's working for a very few people. So, and I think, I mean, one of the descriptions of this discussion was around food security and social stability and saying, are they interconnected? So I just wanted to maybe start on that. And it relates to what I said just now, because it's a highly unequal society, and that's at the core of our problems. And that is going to make it very unstable. You know, we have just 10% of the population own over 85% of the wealth of the country, whereas 50%, the poorest 50%, have a negative 2.5%. That is, the poorest 50% in our country own nothing, or they owe more money than the limited assets they have. And then that's reflected most painfully, I would say, in food. You know, and BFAP, say that 50% of South Africans cannot afford a healthy diet. So there's half the population for whom this economy and the society simply doesn't work. So why would those people, be vested in the society? It's not working for them at the most fundamental level of I can't get enough food to eat a healthy diet. I can't get healthy food for my children. And of course, it's the combination, as Mervyn was indicating, between, what does food cost versus what do I have as an income? And on both sides of that, our current agriculture and food system is not working for the majority of people, because the technology that makes us world leaders in some places, and I thought it was interesting, Hamlet, that you didn't say it was seen in South Africa as, one of the best. It's seen in the world out there, and that reflects, the orientation of the commercial agricultural sector. We're the only country in the world that has a strategy for white maize, which is our staple food, an export strategy. The priority for our white maize strategy of the government at the moment is exports, while this is a staple food that feeds most people. That to me says a lot about where our priorities are. And I would say our priorities have to be with people on the ground. And the current food and agricultural system is not creating enough jobs, and it is not making food accessible enough, especially in terms of price. And I can go into some of the figures, maybe I've talked too long already, but the gap between what the farmer gets and what we pay in the shops, is quite horrendous. And that's something which is really a food system question that we need to dig into as well and say, how do we address that kind of gap? Because it's not the farmers that are benefiting. I'm not criticizing the farmers. I mentioned maize, so let me just use that as an example. 2 companies in South Africa control 70% of the maize trade. Just 2 companies, 70% of the maize trade. So when we increased exports of maize, 98.5% last year, in the time of a COVID crisis with more people going hungry, and we increased by 98%, that's almost doubled our maize exports. It wasn't even the farmers, big or small, who are really benefiting when you have just 2 companies that control 70% of that maize trade. Let me pause there for now. Thanks.
Mark, you make a passionate argument, and it's because people and food are linked very clearly, very directly, and we can't ignore that. At the same time, I would argue that having competitive food producers in South Africa is a good thing, with good technology, and being competitive internationally is a good thing. And being able to export is a good thing. The problem is when we sit in a situation, and this is from a FairPlay perspective, when we sit in a situation where other countries support their farmers through various means, including subsidies, and enable them against the WTO rules to dump product here that destroy local producers, who goes under first? Well, clearly, over the years, we've seen it's small-scale farmers. Thousands of small-scale farmers are no longer able to compete when chicken is dumped, which is an issue we've focused on, when sugar is dumped. And when that happens, as in recently, a tariff on potatoes that should have been instituted was not done by ITAC. When that happens, it's the small-scale farmers who go under first. So it's livelihoods for small-scale farmers. The second issue is that it's people at the bottom end of the employment ladder. Because you rightly point out, big companies can look after themselves. They can take advantage of international trends. When they come under pressure, they cut jobs and cost. But the small people can't look after themselves. And that's why I think it's very important from this perspective to look at everything. We can't have We can't become a country with no competitive or internationally competitive food producers, but at the same time, we can't allow, Brazilian producers to destroy local industry, local food producers, small-scale farmers. So, Mervyn, I assume that's one of the things that would bother you, is when we see people at the bottom end of the scale being pushed out of the market because we don't apply the rules strongly enough.
Francois, so yes, I mean, there are numerous possible entry points to this, and of course the international trade regulations are skewed to favor those in the north rather than those in the south, and at home, of course, it plays out in our own inequities that we have. So yes, we because if you dump chicken or if you dump sugar, you take away the possibility of some form of job creation in this country. So that's definitely one issue we should get some clarity on. But I also want to agree with what Mark is saying, is that we also have to look locally at the monopolistic nature of big commercial enterprises. And it is clear, as he said, that it's not the farmers who are benefiting from the system by and large. Yeah. It's others higher up the value chain who are benefiting from this and are therefore pushing up the price. And that creates its own set of problems. So when a farmer is not able to get a proper just value for his or her produce, of course, the injustice of that plays out on the farm worker because the farmer do not have sufficient income in order to pay the farm worker the situation. So it is ironic that the most food insecure sector of South African society are actually farm workers. They are the hungriest of it all. And so therefore the question around, should food be made cheaper or should income be increased is a really interesting one, because a cheap food system will actually be built on the backs of farmers and farm workers. And so we have to keep this thingy in a balance. And we would argue that it is at the level of economic growth and higher wages, rather than pushing down the price and the nutritional level of the food that we consume.
That's interesting.
Francois, if I could maybe just raise some of the comments in our group before we continue on. One of the few things that came through was from Gwen Foster, and I think Mark responded, saying that one of the issues affecting smallholder and community production is local regulations, such as food safety records, etc. We are not supporting these barriers to access. Janet also saying, I think that affects smallholder farmers most is the lack of support towards productivity. There's also one question here from Imtizam saying, who are these two big corporates that control the farming sector, please? So they're wanting some clarity on that also, just to highlight some of the points being raised from our participants on this call.
That's right. And if you recall, a lot of money was spent on supporting small business during the lockdowns because of the enormous job creation effort of small business. So I agree with Mark on that one. It's very important. But Hamlet, on the issue of how we bring economic growth, and you mentioned technology, and surely technology is important, and we should get technology into the hands of small-scale farmers as well. I'm sure Mark would agree with that, and Mervyn would agree that we need to make everyone more productive and better. But what else can be done to encourage growth, also in terms of the wealth of farm workers? Because this idea that you work on a farm producing food and you go hungry, how can we even live with that?
Yeah, that is the most sad part, Francois, and I agree with Melvin on that. But I do want to just go back to what Mark said, which I totally agree with him that, it's the people that eat food. It's not really the country. But I do also want to say we cannot blame that on the sector. The sector is doing well as a sector, and we need to acknowledge that. And I think the problem that we have in the country, it relates to the policies that we implement in the country that are actually the ones to blame in terms of why we have not achieved inclusive growth in the sector 27 years since the country transitioned into democracy. So I think that's where the debate should be around. It should not be around the fact that, to Mark's point, that there's something wrong. There's nothing wrong. The only thing that is wrong in the sector is that the policies that should encourage, inclusivity in terms of growth in the sector are not being implemented in the way that they should. And another thing that I want to highlight also is that when you look at the food security in this country and looking at the components thereof, is that looking at the three components: one, the availability; two, the affordability; and three, on the nutrition side. We don't have so much issues on that, and I know the debate might come around the issues that we have seen in the past 2 years with regards to listeriosis and all of those things. It's something that happens everywhere. But let me come back to the issue of affordability. In South Africa, the current prices that we have around food are very competitive. Actually, they are very competitive comparing to our emerging market counterparts and some of actually the developed countries in the world. Again, I'm going to say that it's not the issue of affordability. For me, it's an issue of not having money, which should be coming to citizens through employment, that is not getting them food. It's also important also to highlight that when it comes to the farm workers in the sector, and I agree with Malvin, most of the farm workers in this country, they are the ones that are actually affected the most by food insecurity in this country. And we need to look into that. And one of the things that we need to do is, can't we push a policy that will ensure that farm workers are actually part owners to these farms that they are working for? And I think that is actually very important, so that they can have also something to claim on the farms that they are actually working for. On the issue of productivity, I don't think so much productivity is a problem, because productivity for me is as a result, is a consequence of something, is as a result of something. If, for instance, we still have so much barriers to entry into the agribusiness sector, particularly for those that are currently excluded in the sector, then productivity, we can talk about it until the cows come home. Nothing is going to happen. Number two, it is important that even when we talk of what needs to happen in the agricultural sector to achieve inclusivity or to have well representation of the demographics of this country, it's important that when we do that, we make those particular citizens part of the solution in terms of what they would like to see coming for them. Because most of the time, a lot of these things and initiatives that are being driven in South Africa, they are decided somewhere for people that are sitting in rural communities elsewhere. and then they are driven or shoved down their throat, without somebody having gone to actually go to them and say, okay, this area, what is the biggest issue according to you, and how can we solve it? And one of the areas for me that is the biggest issue in this country is an area of infrastructure. Rural infrastructure in this country is the biggest issue for me, because even if you have small scale agribusiness enterprises that are operating in the rural areas and would like to be integrated into the value chain, that would not happen with a poor infrastructure. We can never achieve any inclusive growth in this country with a third grade infrastructure that we're seeing in most of the rural communities right now, where farming operations actually exist for a lot of people in this country.
That's so important, this whole issue of infrastructure. And in FairPlay, we like to say we talk about the problem 20% of the time, but we try and find solutions 80% of the time. And I think you've mentioned one solution, which is rural infrastructure. That's very important. Mark, what other solutions might we move to?
Well, before getting to the solutions, let me just highlight a bit of the problem. And when we're talking about the price issue, let me just give you a very concrete sort of example. I've been doing research on the fresh produce trade in particular. Now, if you look over the last year, and this is fairly typical of other years from what we've seen, but taking from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, April 2020 to March 21, the 12-month period, take a simple item like onions, which is sort of a staple in people's diets in their cooking. And you can look at the fresh produce market prices, like Johannesburg Fresh Produce Market, okay? The average price over that period was rand 430 per kilo, which is essentially what the farmer's getting less 12.5%. So the farmer's getting on average 3.77 rand per kilo for onions over the 12 months up to March.
Yeah.
The average retail price over the same period was 16.80 rand. Okay. That is a difference of 12.49 rand per kilo, or 294% difference. This is an onion, okay? It is not processed, it's not ground, it's not changed, it's an onion. Between the wholesale price and the farmer price, 377 to the average retail price you pay in the mainstream shop, 16.80 rand is that price. That's, as I say, just repeating myself. But for me, eye-watering, to use a pun, unfortunate pun, but 12.49 rand, almost 300% difference. Now, where is that going? Where is that going? Now, there's clearly some room for improvement there. And we can look at other bigger examples, of the way in which there's some companies who are making a lot of money out of this food system, and even as food's becoming less and less affordable, as Mervin's work shows and other work shows. I mean, all our big food companies, ShopRite just yesterday reported great new, earnings per share. Tiger Brands in the 6 months to March this year, compared to the previous 6 months. So that's 6 months under COVID, compared to 6 months before, they had over 121% increase in their earnings per share. They increased their profits. Now, how did they do that? Look at a staple like grain that Tiger Brands plays a very big role in supplying us. They said they increased their revenue in their grain division by 10%, okay? How did they do that? Because they had a loss of volume of about 4%. They compensated by a 14% increase in their prices. So Tiger Brands, biggest food company in the country, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, they increased their prices 14% while losing volume, probably because people can't afford to buy, and they record 10% increases in profit on grains alone. They did a similar thing in bread and other areas, and their shareholders are very happy. The biggest shareholder of Tiger Brands being a British-based investment firm. So, okay, that brings me to the opportunity, maybe. While looking at that retail price, one of the things we found is that your street trader is selling at roughly half the price to the supermarket price in fresh produce. Okay. So, and that now makes sense, because you say, okay, they're buying it in the market and those prices I'm telling you about, at around 4.30 a kilo, and they're selling it like 7-8 rand a kilo instead of 16 rand. They're making a reasonable profit. They're supporting themselves, sometimes employing someone else, and they're making the food much more accessible to people there. And what we have found also is that farmers, another research I was recently involved in was looking at black farmers in the fresh produce sector. So where black farmers are linking directly to those street traders, the black farmer gets a better price for their produce, and the street trader sells it on to the end consumer for that price cheaper than the supermarket price. There is a great opportunity to me. And that opportunity is not about people joining the corporate value chains. It's actually about staying out of those corporate value chains, which tend to put the squeeze on those farmers and so on. It's about setting up a different network and connection to more localized markets. I'm not saying only localized. I'm not ruling out the value of certain exports as well, just to be clear on that. But in terms of opportunities for our smaller scale farmers, which, as Hamlet also acknowledges, they are excluded currently, they don't get access to those export markets. In terms of food accessibility to the poorer community, those kind of more localized markets and more direct links, let's say, between a smaller scale farmer and your street traders, your bucky traders, and so on. I think that offers a lot of the solution. It's a solution people are creating for themselves on the ground, so let's build on that kind of solution. Let's build on a different flow of food in more localized and directly connected markets that creates more employment opportunities, and it makes food more accessible.
Mark, you make an important point. I would distinguish between the corporate supply chain and the food value chain, because what I hear you say is we should expand the food value chain. Mervyn, how do we expand the food value chain? There's one idea. The one idea is linking small-scale farmers, or I suppose all farmers, to the different distributors on a small scale in pavement traders and so on. What else can we do?
So I'd like to carry on along the same trend that Mark has mentioned, because I think that in any discussion around food, or most discussions around food and food values chains, we tend to ignore the informal sector. It seems to us one of our biggest learnings last year, and it's strange because we should have been aware of it, was the role, the intensity, the magnitude of the informal sector in terms of feeding low-income households. Because when COVID regulations inadvertently stopped the informal sector from operating, was exactly the time a week later when we saw the spike in hunger across the country. That was around May of last year. That was a direct consequence of the informal sector being closed down. So it seems to us that we should be supporting the informal sector much more. And I want to raise that from another angle. The idea of local food systems, which is not just a South African idea, but which is a global idea. We're going to have to be expecting climate change is real, and we're going to have to prepare for that. We should be expecting more and more pandemics in future. And so the supply lines of food from where it is grown to the table where it's eaten needs, in fact, to be shortened. And if we can be successful at that, that already would create an enormous support to ensuring that low-income households in particular can access sufficient and nutritious food. That's the one area. And then, of course, the second area is that we constantly in South Africa are playing to smaller and smaller markets. The inequality means that very few people are actually engaged in the market. The majority of people are outside the market. How do we bring those outside the market into the market? And how do we help them to demand goods and services, including agricultural goods and food? And the only way we can do that really is to pump money into the pockets of ordinary citizens. And it's in that context that the basic income grant, I believe, should be looked at as a possible alternative to help stimulate demand, which can then be helped by local farmers as well as the more commercial farmers.
So all of you support the idea of helping small-scale farmers. We believe the biggest thing that the government can do from a regulatory perspective, one, and I think you touched on it, Mark, is to ease regulatory rules or regulatory enablement for small-scale farmers, make it easier for them. And small-scale sellers, the retail chain, the informal retail chain. But on a macro level, at FairPlay, we think a vital element is to clamp down on dumping, because frankly, Brazilian chickens don't eat South African maize, and when they come in here, they're not helping anyone because the profit goes to the middleman. Now, how do you think we can, so that's one solution that we stand for, is really a serious effort to keep predatory trade out of the country. But what other efforts can we make to ensure that we solve food insecurity on a large scale? Hamlet.
Thank you, Francois. I think another thing for me that has been the biggest issue in the country is if we look at the whole agricultural sector as a whole, it's still rooted for me in the past historical legacy of which we have already discussed in exclusion. But also, we can debate in terms of what needs to really happen to get everybody who wants to get in the sector be able to do so. But the biggest issue for me is looking at the landscape of agriculture. There's a number of things that are happening. Mark alluded to that you have mostly, which I touched on as well, a lot of those 39,000 commercial farmers that are contributing now to the growth. The question is, how do we get others more? But even in that 39,000 commercial farmers that are driving the sector, if we look at them, it's a group that is really aging, Francois. And we need to start talking about, how do we address the aging population in the agricultural sector, which indeed is actually driving growth in the sector currently. And I've had numerous conversations around this point and numerous requests from young people in this country asking a question of how do I get into the sector? Because I see that I can do something here. One thing that we need to do first is to change the image of the sector. That's one thing for me. We need to make the sector look like more representative of the demographics of this country. But over and above that, let's get more young people into the sector. And for them to get into the sector, there has to be a point where they see that there is value for them in the sector. Let's voice out what are those incentives that can attract them into the sector if they are, and let them actually access those incentives. Another thing that I think we need to start looking at in this country, I'm in a banking space, is when you look at the commercial banking sector in this country, it would look like it's discriminatory against small-scale agribusiness enterprises. I keep on using these words because it's very important that we understand that when you get into the sector, you get into the sector to be commercialized. You know, for you to be able to make a meaningful contribution to the growth, commercialization is very important. So going back to the point of the banking sector, looking like it is discriminatory against small-scale agribusiness enterprises. And it's a point that is a lot of people are talking about. My point is this: perhaps we need to look at the financing models within the commercial banking sector and see what concessions we can make to accommodate those small-scale agribusiness enterprises that would not have what the normal big business would have in terms of a very strong balance sheet, in terms of a strong collateral and all of that. But we need to find a way of how do we look at a small-scale agribusiness enterprise. We should not have the same requirements for the small-scale business enterprises as we do have for the commercial large-scale big businesses, which do have a strong balance sheet, which do have collateral. So one thing that I need to emphasize is that financial support is key to ensuring that whoever comes in at an entry point into the sector, they are supported with those resources that will make them successful. And currently, both in the private sector and in government, that support, in my view, it's not really coming. And government should not be scared to actually invest into the small scale agribusiness or business enterprises. You alluded to, Francois, that there are so many countries that are providing financial support to their small scale businesses and even subsidies in other countries. When you look at South Africa, which is competing at a global market with countries that are being supported by their governments, South Africa is not doing that to a greater extent. And that is one thing that we need to, we need to look at.
Thank you, Hamlet. I just want to say, Dawn, this webinar is already having an effect. Someone asked about a food bank. Douglas came up and said, well, I'm working on one. And suddenly Chris Engelbrecht said, well, maybe we can link and do something in the Eastern Cape. And this, for me, is the most encouraging thing when instead of talking, we connect.
No, definitely.
What can we do to connect better? How do we connect small-scale farmers with finance? How do we connect them with better technology? How do we connect the policymakers to provide infrastructure? Even something simple. I mean, Mervyn mentioned the effect on the informal sector and hunger as a result of lockdowns. How do we get some better policy making done in this whole effort?
Before Mark starts, could I maybe also just highlight one of the last points that Hamlet was making around, the type of jobs that are available within the agricultural sector? I think so many of what's available is often overlooked by young people who enter the sector.
Yeah.
They just think about farming and agricultural work. And I mean, I work in the agricultural sector, but as a journalist. So what are some of the scarce jobs that we can sort of look at and encourage young people and people who need jobs to look into and apply for? And what do we encourage in terms of development in that aspect? And how do we recruit and retain this talent within the sector? Maybe we can also move the conversation towards that, Mark.
Okay, well, there are many issues, but in terms of getting to the right kind of policies, I think we need to change our way of thinking. And I don't think the solution is trying to integrate more people into the dominant current corporate system that's been talked about. And I don't agree that what I'm talking about is supply chains. And if you look at the theory and the history of supply chains from Porter and onwards and so on, I mean, that is about where the lead company arranges this whole supply chain.
I'm not in favor of that.
We actually need more open markets And I'm in favor of markets, but real markets where real people meet and trade with each other, and that's different from a supply chain. We're having more and more like supply chains and less real markets. And on that, there's many things I want to touch on, but I do want to mention that the municipal fresh produce markets in the country still perform a really important role, and what you can see there is that, yes, I mean, there's challenges with them. I don't want to go into all of those, but they still create the space where you get that price discovery between supply and demand. They create the space where even if you're a small farmer, you might complain about pricing, whatever, but you can sell. And they definitely create the space where, hundreds of thousands of street traders, bucket traders, and so on buy to distribute. And from those figures I shared earlier on the onions, and I can say the figures are similar on potatoes, slightly less bad on tomatoes, etc. But that's the norm. The problem is not in those markets. The problem is what's happening between there and the retailer. So I think but we're not investing in those markets. We're letting them go into decay, and they're losing market share. And if they're not there, the small farmer who can go and sell a bucky load, once a week there is not going to be able to supply the Woolworths or the ShopRite or something. So we need those markets. But also what we've seen over the last years is where we used to have them in every small town. Now there's only, I think, 17 main ones, and it's become very centralized. So and even those become cash cows for municipalities rather than something that municipalities value and invest in improving. So we need to build on a lot of what already works, like the good components of the municipal markets, the links that farmers themselves make with the street traders and so on. And with the youth, I mean, I follow on Twitter a lot of like young farmers, and there's a whole dynamic around that, which is quite encouraging. And I see, just in line with what you were saying, Dawn, I mean, I've talked to young Black farmers who are also in the communication space and, and also doing things like training. So they like farmers who are into hydroponics or setting up the tents, the tunnels, and quite a lot of them getting into training other farmers. So that's really encouraging. And we should build on that, and build on what people are already doing. And that's something that we seem to not quite get right in South Africa, and an example for me is in land reform, and maybe just to refer to this study, because I was just editing a paper on it yesterday, but we did an in-depth study with about 40 Black farmers in the vegetable fresh produce trade over the last year, basically during COVID. And of those 40 farmers, these are all Black small-scale farmers, under 50 hectares, most of them under 10 hectares of land, but they are all selling to markets. So they're selling. But 11 of them have totally insecure tenure on the land they're on. They're renting from other people, or they have like no even clear rental arrangement. 23 of them are on communal land and questionable security there. Only 5 of them own land, and 2 of those who are renting, they're renting land from land redistribution beneficiaries who can't produce. So the government's giving land to some people who don't or can't produce. In some cases, they're renting to another farmer. But the fact that you've got these farmers, and 13 of the 14 were under 35, so that there's young people there. They are working and they're trying to do that. So that's what we have to build on. But when young Black farmers are farming and selling to the market, but they can't get land, then there's something going wrong with our land reform. And where young Black farmers have got land and they're producing, but they can't get viable markets, then there's something wrong happening there. So I think, we do need more land reforms, but that has to go along with other changes and transformations in the food sector that open up markets and so on, and create different kinds of market links and networks. But build on what people are doing, open up the space, create that right of a place to trade, and where you can undercut that supermarket, create that right to some land where you can produce if you're going to produce, and produce on that land, and build on what people are already doing.
Community markets, what a wonderful idea. I think that's a terrific idea, and all part of the value chain. Mervyn, it looks like you're bursting at the seams to contribute. So
not, I mean, I think it's an extremely interesting idea that you've just mentioned around community markets. And in response to your question, why are we not getting good policy? And why are the regulations actually acting against our ability to feed everybody? Really is, I think, that government has adopted a particular form of a mindset, which is the bigger the commercial enterprise, the better. And unless we are going to turn that upside down, and unless we're going to start and say that small is also beautiful and local is also great, and begin to look for policy directions that would support those efforts, I think we are always going to beat on the wrong side. I mean, I don't know if one of the companies that Mark alluded to in terms of produce, but I mean, I've heard of tomatoes being so expensive because it's being transported all the way from Limpopo down to KZN. So the question is, I mean, can people not grow it here? Can we not create markets around here? But of course, because, you know, government seems to invest and create policy for massive, big commercial enterprises. And actually the answer globally is towards small-scale farming and local food systems. And I think unless we're going to go in that direction, we are never going to feed all our people and ensure a food security for all.
Can I just jump in there on this issue of scale and really support that point? Because so often the obstacle becomes the scale fit between your scale of production, the scale of processing, and so on. You know, and when you have, you know, only a few companies owning all our silo capacity and so on, you can see that problem. And the direction at the moment is going in the wrong direction. And because what we're moving away from even having farmers sometimes. An example is Farm Secure. It's a private investment fund that has been mostly foreign funds, that has now bought 140,000 hectares of land in South Africa, and on which they produce 7% now of our total grain output. One investment fund, foreign-owned investment fund, now controls 140,000 hectares. They're also massive in other areas, oil seeds and so on. Now, that is the way we're moving. Within that, there's very little space for open markets. There's very little space for your local farmer. And, you know, even our big farm, I mean, you know, our classic white commercial farmer, at least they were generally family farmers. They're being replaced now by investment fund managers where the accountants are making the decisions. And they will bring in operating companies to do things like planting and so on. So even the nature of that is shifting. And I would say it's shifting in the wrong direction in terms of then who's controlling that, who's benefiting from that, where the profits from that are going, and the space that is closing out. There's no room in that to bring in more and more owners. We need, you know, a system where people are not just employees, but where people become owners of land, owners of their own enterprises, take responsibility for that. And that has to mean some unbundling of this kind of concentration. But instead, we're going a different direction.
Can I just come in here as well, Mark, and on the same line, we also need to think quite seriously around unbundling and the retail excessive power to the 5 retail companies to bargain down the farmer who's suffering the process, etc. And as you've said, you know, increase their margins. And the whole idea around shopping malls that we've become so accustomed to, rather than the street grocer and the street retailer. I mean, it's a total, I think, a mental shift. And I think somebody, and perhaps FairPlay can do this, should be able to just explore that without saying it's impossible. I mean, that's what policy, who's going to pay for it? It's impossible, hence end of conversation. But to begin to explore how can we shift that even on the farms, to hand farms back to farmers in collaboration with the farm workers, but also in the retail space. How can the retail space be transformed into smaller sectors rather than these massive megalo malls, etc.?
Francois, if I could maybe come here and maybe just shift the conversation a bit. We are almost reaching 3 o'clock, and I know that we had said that the discussion would be for an hour, and I'm sure we can have the panelists talk about this all day. There's just a comment that came here through on the chat group from Chris Engelbrecht. Chris saying, how do we deal more effectively with food waste from the farm to the table? Current regulations prevent the use of food past sell-by dates in these cheaper shops, or food banks, community nutrition and development centers are closed down by health inspectors. So how do we kind of shift the conversation to there as we close off today? The importance of bringing society around to understand how our food systems operate, and what households can do in terms of reducing their wastage, as well as improving their nutrition. I think we were talking about maize earlier. And how do we reduce the risk related to our food culture? Maybe we can start that conversation as we close off today.
Thank you. I think food safety and food security go hand in hand, and it shouldn't be a choice between the two. But very often it's also just simply a complete inflexibility in the way in which regulations are applied. And I think there should be a better education of civil servants as well about how to apply the regulations in a sensible way when it comes to smaller operations and community food banks and so on. I think, Mervyn, we are on the same page about saying we need the small players, we need them visible, but we need regulations that are sensible and sensitive to the needs of the smaller parts of the community. I hear Mark saying the same thing, and access to finance for the small players in a way that doesn't burden and cripple them. I hear Hamlet saying. So I think we need to close down the session, but why don't you give us your best shot at, say, 2 things that we can all do?
So the first thing is I would argue very strongly for support for the informal sector, because the informal sector feeds a lot. And let's look at policy frameworks, whether it's expanding with that responsibility more to support the informal food sector, and begin to support local small-scale farmers for local food systems. I mean, that for me would be, it's already happening. Let's come behind those people and let's give them a push.
Thank you, Mervyn. Hamlet, I'm going to ask you for 2 quick points, and then Mark can close off for us, can close the discussion from the panelists before Dawn closes off the webinar for us. So 2 quick points, Hamlet.
I think I do have to agree with Melvin on this. We really need to get more support where it's needed the most, and I think where it's needed the most, it's actually at that level of local communities, and it's important that they given an engine to actually connect amongst each other and start trading amongst each other, and which is something that we're not seeing there. I think we need support in that, but over and above that, we also need some level of, say, education or training that can be provided, you know, to those local, call them small scale agribusiness enterprises, so that they can be able to trade amongst each other efficiently. We should never assume that this thing is known by people out there. We should spend money into training them and making sure that they have all the resources that they need for them to be successful.
Thank you. Mark, take it home for us.
Yeah, well, I would respond on the waste question as well with an approach that would cover the other issues we've been raising as well, which is to have a more circular economy. I was going to say that before you put that in the chat line, Chris. I only saw your comment now. You know, and the circular economy being that, you know, where we circulate more of the food and the wealth from that, and we recirculate anything that's seen as waste back into production as well, obviously in forms like composting, manure use, and so on. And we see how, you know, like the massive cattle feed plot turns manure from cattle into a poison to the soil. But small farmers linked to horticulture use that manure as the engine for the energy for feeding and growing the horticulture. So we need multitude of different actors that are linked in more circular relations that maximize the value within communities and local communities. I do just want to say we can't over-localize, especially in South Africa with its inequality, rural-urban inequalities and so on. We have people who live in communities that are too poor. You can't just circulate poverty in that. They do need links beyond that. But you can still structure those links in a more circular way, and with more actors, involved in that, smaller scale actors involved in that. That's still quite possible. So I think that's what we have to work on, and it requires the right regulation. Because look, you can't, the shareholding corporation is going to try and serve its shareholders' interests. So it has to be regulated. We can't just appeal to goodwill. And we have to invest in infrastructure, as others have said, but the right kind of infrastructure to support, for example, those local markets, the right kind of technology that works for the smaller scale producer and the smaller scale processing and so on. So the right regulation that supports that, the right local planning, and the right kind of technology to support more circular economies with multitudes of actors who own something in this.
That's hopeful. Dawn, will you close up for us?
Thank you so much, Francois. I was actually hoping that you'd take the last word, but maybe just one comment from, I would maybe hand over to you as we close off. I think one of the important things is that we build resilience at community level. I think we learn so much, and some of the points that Mervyn raised is about, we learn from many communities and the non-governmental sector, such as churches, charities, and local entrepreneurs and volunteers, that have seen local hunger and stepped in to help those that are vulnerable, the same way that you would go to your neighbor and ask for a cup of sugar or a tea bag or an egg. That's basically how it works. And so sometimes it's also it's important to identify individuals rather than groups. And one of the important things that came up today and that you mentioned earlier, Francois, is building the right kind of networks. And that happened while we were having this discussion today. So I'd just like to thank you again for inviting me to facilitate. It feels more of like a discussion more than anything else. And thank you so much for everyone who engaged on the platform. We hope to have many more of these conversations in the future with FairPlay and Food for Mzansi. So last word over to you, Francois.
It's so nice of you, Dawn. Thank you. Well, without Food for Mzansi, this wouldn't have happened. And Dawn, you're always willing to put Food for Mzansi out there and to help us to get the message across, but more importantly, to make the connections and to learn from each other. And what I find really encouraging is that we couldn't cover every topic in this conversation. We still have to talk about all the jobs available, all the new things that are happening, all the solutions that are possible. But the one thing I take away from this discussion is that there are people who can give hope because they have solutions and they have ideas. And as long as we have hope, then we can work to make it a reality. So thank you, everybody. I salute you for the work you do. Thanks for joining us on this panel. And Dawn, thanks for hosting us. You're a wonderful host.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.